as far as our programme is concerned, we have left the last period of time for what is described as an opportunity to reminisce by any attendee. Now, I think we've had a variety of reminiscences already, but this is now open to, as it were, the floor to invite any comments or memories that you might have of George Porter and the various topics around his life that we've heard about today. So the floor is yours. Has anybody got any comments or anecdotes they wish to share? Is the microphone disappeared? Because we have, oh no, there we are. We can pass it. If we can just pass it back. One, thank you very much.
I've got a little personal reflection on Professor Sir George Porter, as I knew him. In the early 70s, I was an undergraduate at the University of Canterbury, and perhaps because he lived up the road, he was, during the university's early years, a visiting professor. I think it was during 1973, I and a few students decided to start a physics and chemistry society, for reasons I'll go into now. And we decided to invite Professor Sir George Porter to give our inaugural lecture. And he very kindly agreed to, and I had the honour of introducing him. And I can remember standing in front of a packed lecture theatre full of students, and in the front row, all the professors and the senior lecturers, as I introduced George Porter, who gave a wonderful lecture, which I can't remember at all because I was very anxious about what was going to happen afterwards, which was a dinner. She was guest of honour with the staff and students, and he was so supportive of our new society and a wonderful bloke, and it's a very fond memory of mine.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. Anybody else got anything to share? We're all being shy. It looks like David wants to say something. Do you want to? Yes, please.
Well, I could give you many stories, but Mary knows this. When we had Friday lunchtime discussion groups in the Royal Institution, we're now talking about the early 80s, when he was very enthusiastic, as Mary has said, about artificial photosynthesis. And he used to begin his lectures by saying, nature is miserably inefficient at converting light into storable energy, usable energy. In fact, you know, photosynthetic process is about 1% efficient. Surely mankind, with all of our knowledge of physics, chemistry, materials, can do better than that. And by the time he left in 1985, he was saying, although nature is miserably inefficient at converting it, who are we to take on the Almighty?
Thank you for that. Any other comments? In that case, can I share a slightly distant one? Because I might ask family or people who know him the answer to this one. My PhD supervisor was a lady called Jo Dueck, and she was a judge, I think, the very final series of Young Scientist of the Year, when Professor Sir George Porter was, I think, the chairman of the judges and was on every episode. She wasn't quite on every episode. She did 2 or 3 in the series. But she was greatly amused to be asked by the BBC about where to send the cheque. Did she have an agent? And she thought that was a bit of a joke for an academic chemist. But I wonder, did Sir George Porter have an agent? Did he do all the work he did for the BBC? Or was he also bemused and had to persuade them to send a cheque to him personally? Maybe you don't know, I don't know. But
Judith would have been the intermediary there.
right. She counted as agent, did she, as far as the BBC were concerned? Yeah. Right. Any other Any things people want to share? David, again, please.
As long as I'm not outstaying my welcome.
You're certainly not. Please carry on.
I was a lecturer rising to reader in the University of Southampton before I came here. And we invited George down to give what had been a discourse here as a student chemical society lecturer. And of course, he was such a polished performer, we expected great things. Somewhere between him preparing his slides and giving them to the projectionist in Southampton, they had clearly been dropped and put back into the wrong order. And it's about the only time I ever saw George visibly angry and rattled, because he would say, and here is a picture of Faraday's wife. There'd be a picture of a statue of a man on a horse upside down, you know, things of this sort. And unfortunately, the projectionist was my first research student. And George complained, whereupon the student, instead of being quiet, he said, this was the 70s, remember? He said, listen, mate, he said, I'm showing these slides in exactly the order you gave them to me. If anybody's made a mistake, you have. So this student was severely censored by the head of department afterwards. But not long afterwards, I came up to give a lunchtime discussion group talk, and I brought this student with me, and we were standing around, you know, before lunch. And I could see George looking across and twitching. He clearly remembered this child from something unpleasant. He couldn't think what it was, and I thought, all it needs is for that student to come over and start talking to me, for George to twig who it was, and that would be the end of my career forever. But the student had the wisdom to sort of disappear behind a pillar and not do it. But I have to say, George I always found him very equable, but on that occasion he was really livid, absolutely. Understandably so.
Yes, yes. Oh, over here. Can we pass the microphone across, if that's all right?
I just want to say I really enjoyed Rupert Cole's lecture, and it brought back a period when I had particularly intense arguments with my father when I was at Cambridge for the first time and picking up radical ideas like DDT was no good and that kind of thing. And that would really get into the most intense arguments. But they were the right arguments, and things have moved forward since then. So it's a very exciting time.
Can we just wait till the microphone gets across? It's just a bit difficult for everyone to hear. And we have, in principle, I think we still have some online people with us. So thank you.
A phrase that I remember he used to kind of end that debate quite often was throwing the baby out with the bathwater. I don't know if he ever mentioned that to you, but over and over again in relation to sort of DDT, and yes, it's problematic, but we shouldn't reject all chemical technology or industrial technology as a result. So I was just, yeah, I don't know why that phrase really stuck in my mind, but yeah, it's really interesting to have those debates with you as well.
Another one over there, if you can pass the microphone. Thank you.
Thanks. There's another area he was interested in, which you might have touched on in some of your research, which was not so much sort of hippie environmental stuff, but it was more to do with pseudoscience. And there was around about that period, Uri Geller was on television a lot, and that was another battle front he fought on quite a lot. And I do remember I think it was after a discourse of some kind that in the Royal Institution Lecture Theatre, he had this chap called Randy, can't remember his first name, James Randi, and he was a magician, but he was a magician who told everybody how he did his tricks rather than pretending that he was really a magician. And he had this trick where he would he would have a handkerchief wrapped up in his hand like that. Well, no, how did he do this though? He said, yeah, I've got a handkerchief, I'm going to make it disappear. It's a very flimsy handkerchief, and he'd put it rolled up in his hand like this. And he'd say, right, I'm going to make it, watch this. And then he'd throw it in the air and say, look, it's gone. And everybody in the audience could see that the handkerchief had flown away behind, except the person watching his hand. And they looked amazed. And he loved this because it was an example of how people pull the wool over your eyes. And I can't remember how long that went on for, but he was decades. Yeah, maybe somebody else has a story along those lines.
Do we have any? Oh yes, please do.
Yeah, I was absolutely fascinated to read his interactions with pseudoscience and parapsychology in particular. And I remember the debate you referred to. It was James Randi and it was a physicist called Taylor. I don't know if anyone remembers his first name. And Taylor was involved with Uri Geller and a really eminent quantum physicist of the time at Birkbeck University, and they were doing experiments with Geller. And Porter and the BBC invited them to do a programme in this series called Controversy, which I wish I'd mentioned. It's probably one of my favourite programmes Porter was involved with. And it was basically a debating show which involved the audience. And that's where that Randy versus Taylor thing came from. But yeah, I think you mentioned Eric Laithwaite earlier. He also got involved in things around extrasensory perception. And when he gave his really controversial discourse and Christmas lecture saying he had broken, was it Newton's second law of motion with gyroscopes, he also accompanied the announcement to the press before publishing in a scientific journal that it had been anticipated in a dream by extrasensory perception. And there's this wonderful, wonderful letter from George Porter to Eric Laithwaite, which basically chides Eric Laithwaite after the discourse and warns him, do not mention any of this mumbo-jumbo in the Christmas lectures. And then it ends, you are not the Messiah, Eric. It's one of my favourite lines of Porter's I'd ever read.
Thank you. Any other last thoughts? Frank, do you need to say anything, or is it all right if we wind up there?
No,
I think it's been a brilliant day. Thank you to everybody who's contributed for also that last little bit of discussion and sharing. That's great. There is tea available before you go if you want to share more thoughts and mull over times, and particularly those of you who knew Sir George Porter, Lord Porter. You may want to stay particularly and share some thoughts. But anyway, there is tea available. But thank you all for coming, and thank you to everyone who's spoken and made this such a memorable event. Thank you.